Welcome back to another episode of Grizzly True Crime. My name is Gisela K, and today we're going to be working through the document that was released yesterday on the 12th of January 2022 relating to the police stop on August 12th of 2021 with Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. So, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you are new here, then I hope that at some point during this video, you'll consider subscribing and becoming part of the Grizzlies. And if you already are a Grizzly, then welcome back. It's so nice to see you. I'm going to shrink myself down, put myself in the corner here so that you can see this clearly. And I'm going to read through this with you. So let's get started with it. The City of Moab, Utah, Statement on Investigative Review of August 12th Petito Laundrie Incident. In fact, here and there, let me take myself off screen so that we can really see it, and I'll pop on and off as I make commentary, okay? After a formal complaint was filed with the Moab City Police Department, an independent law enforcement agency has completed a thorough review of the August 12, 2021 domestic violence incident involving Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. The independent agency's investigative report finds that the officers who responded to the incident made several unintentional mistakes that stemmed from the fact that officers failed to cite Ms. Petito for domestic violence. The city acknowledges that this finding may raise questions, and the issue is examined extensively in the investigative report. The report recommends improvements to both policies and the training of the Moab City Police Department. These recommendations include providing additional training in domestic violence investigation, as well as additional legal training to ensure officers understand state laws and statutes, conducting an overall policy review, conducting a software review, and strengthening the review process for incident reports. The investigative report also finds that a statement was never obtained from the original 911 caller and recommends that be done to make the incident report more complete. The city intends to implement the report's recommendations. So, what I like about this already is just, remember, in covering this, I know there was a lot of discussion. I had some guests on the show as well that were former law enforcement, and there's always this debate of, did they do a good job or not? And it's, people say they did an excellent job. Some people say they did a terrible job. And the goal is never, ever to bash police. Okay, that's not the goal. What I was always saying in this case was just, what can we learn from this? Or what can police learn from this? What could have been done better? And remember, that little question that I posed is just asking anyone in a situation where DV may be involved, ask both parties, are you scared right now? Like, how do you feel? Like, are you worried for your own safety? Do you feel scared? And the only reason I posed that question is because I've been in situations that were terrible. And if one person just grabbed me by the arm and said, "Are you scared right now? Are you feeling okay?" To me, it would have been a lifeline. So I hope that could help someone out there. But they are saying here that there were unintentional mistakes made. So it's not like they meant to do this, but there are things they could work on and learn from. So I think that's really great. Based on the report's findings, the City of Moab believes our officers showed kindness, respect, and empathy in their handling of this incident. As the Moab City Police Department continues its daily mission to serve our community, efforts are underway to provide additional resources and tools to assist in addressing domestic violence incidents. Plans are in place to add a trained domestic violence specialist to oversee incidents investigated by Moab officers. We will also implement added and ongoing training and testing to ensure that the officers understand policies and procedures. The City of Moab sends our sincere condolences to the Petito family. Our hearts go out to them as they continue to deal with this tragic loss of their daughter. Okay, I mean, One of the police officers I had on, I can't remember exactly who that was, said, I think it was actually Stephen Keogh, former Scotland Yard, said, these police officers are going to live through this every day. It's going to bug them for a long time. Like, could I have done better? Could I have done more? What did I miss? Like, it's not like they're sitting there like, whatever. I would assume that they are quite torn up about this, and knowing that someone that they try to help and trying to help the situation, Gabby, was murdered 2 weeks later. I mean, that must be so shocking to them. When they learned that news, that must have really shocked them, right? Okay, so let's keep it going. We got the Price Police 100 years. Price City Officer, Utah. Okay. Report information. This document contains the investigative review into how Moab case number 2021-001108 was investigated. Captain Brandon Ratcliffe, Price City Police Department. Okay, we've got the table of contents here. We can just go through that fast. If it's anything that's like not that important, I'll just zoom right through it. You can go read it yourself. Thank you so much to Robert, one of my members and Grizzlies and patrons, for sending me this document so speedily. I was actually looking for it a little bit, and I'm like, I really want to cover this, but there it was in my inbox, which was so nice. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's focus on this. On September 27, 2021, I was asked to conduct an independent investigation into the way Moab Police Department handled a DV incident that occurred on August 12, 2021. The incident has been documented by Moab police officers Eric Pratt and Daniel Robbins. That's so weird, Daniel Robbins, because we're covering the Daniel Robinson case. So I'm like, what? Okay, this incident has been documented by Moab police officers Eric Pratt and Daniel Robbins and is identified by Moab PD case number 2021-001108. There were also 2 additional officers on scene, Park Ranger Melissa Hulls and Park Ranger Ryan Krull. The incident involved Brian Christopher Laundrie and Gabby Petito. I was asked to conduct this investigation by Chief Brett Edge and Assistant Chief Braden Palmer. Officer Pratt has worked with the Moab City Police Department intermittently since July 2018. This included part-time employment and full-time employment. Officer Pratt returned full-time with Moab City Police Department in December of 2020. Officer Pratt has approximately 16 years of law enforcement experience. At the time of this incident, Officer Pratt was the acting field training officer for Officer Robbins. Officer Robbins was hired in May 2021 with the Moab City Police Department and had no prior law enforcement experience. At the time of this incident, Officer Robbins was on the final phase of his field training program. I have been forwarded an email from the initial complainant, attorney Tanya Reeves, which I have attached to this report. Chief Edge indicated the Moab Police Department received the complaint and they believe there is value and insight to be gained from having an independent investigation that will ultimately provide insight and improve the department's responses to DV cases moving forward. The investigator in this case is Captain Brandon Ratcliffe, who is employed by the Price City Police Department. Disclaimer. That's a long disclaimer, right? Look at this disclaimer. Okay. As part of my investigation, I reviewed the body-worn camera footage and interviewed Assistant Chief Palmer, Officer Pratt, and Officer Robbins. The interviews were recorded using an audio recording device. The interviews with Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins were done following the issuance of a Garrity Statement of Rights. While watching the videos and listening to the audio interviews, I typed notes as it related to each of the recordings. During those notes, there were times where I attempted to transcribe the interactions, questions, and answers. The notes should in no way be considered an exact transcription of the recordings, as they are likely not accurate and they lack the appropriate grammar and spelling into the way words were actually said compared to how they were written. The notes were made specifically to allow myself a way to review what I observed more easily rather than trying to review these recordings more times than absolutely necessary. Taking notes into each of these recordings have provided me the ability to document a more accurate and detailed report regarding this investigation. On a part-time basis, I have spent months reviewing this case and have been provided the luxury of being able to pause, rewind, fast-forward, take notes, etc. This same luxury is not afforded in the grand majority of police investigations. The officers in this case had about 75 minutes, while I have had an unlimited amount of time. While I have the reports and recordings from this case, I will not pretend to know that I have the same perception the officers had while investigating this case. This is a very well written disclaimer. I like it a lot. Okay. There are many what ifs that have presented itself as part of this investigation. The primary one being, would Gabby be alive today if this case was handled differently? That is an impossible question to answer, despite it being the answer many people want to know. Nobody knows, and nobody will ever know the answer to that question. My job is to provide information into the details of this investigation and if it was handled appropriately. Let me know in the comments below what you think the answer to that question is. In my mind, it doesn't matter how they would have handled this. I don't know if it would have saved Gabby's life, because in my personal opinion, once Brian felt exposed, threatened, humiliated, and like, why is this such a scene? Why are the police even involved? So even if they were both arrested, I think he would have been equally or more angry. What do you think? I don't know. Let's just scroll to the next page. Synopsis. This investigation arises after Moab City Police Department received a complaint about the way Moab PD case number, we know that one already, was handled. The complaint was received by Moab Police Department on September 21st, 2021 by Tanya Reeves. A follow-up complaint was received by Tanya Reeves on October 1st, 2021. I was asked to complete this investigation on September 27th, 2021. Okay. A summary of the facts in this case will be detailed below. The summary will come from information obtained from the officer reports, dispatch notes, and audio, witness statements, and body-worn camera video of the incident. So the thing I can comment there is already from September. It was August 12th when they were stopped. So already the next month there was a complaint, and again on October 1st. So that was, wow. When Gabby Petito was reported missing on September 11th, it was shortly after that this complaint was lodged. Initial call to dispatch. On August 12th, 2021, at 16:39:16, the Grand County Dispatch Center received a call from who was calling to report what he described as a domestic dispute. This person reports he was driving and saw a gentleman slapping the girl. He stated he stopped driving and the male and female ran up and down the sidewalk, where he proceeded to hit her. He stated they hopped in the van and drove off. He said that he took a picture of the license plate and describes the vehicle and the license plate information, and further describes the make, model, and other characteristics of the van. It must have been quite a scene, huh? For people to actually be like, oh my word, we have to call 911 immediately. I mean, Moab is a small community, and they were like, probably not used to seeing quite something like that, meaning that it's not, I suppose it could be anywhere, but in a small, peaceful, lovely community, from what I've read and heard about Moab, whoa, this must have been like, what are they doing? Like running up and down the sidewalk and fighting, and Gabby trying to get in her own car. Dispatch action. Dispatch uses the emergency tone and alerts all law enforcement working in the area of the call they just received. Dispatch states they had a report of a male hitting a female, and the van left northbound from the Moonflower Community Co-op. Dispatch further provided a description of the vehicle to law enforcement. Moonflower Co-op action. Officer Pratt arrives on the scene at the Moonflower Community Co-op where the incident took place and asks dispatch for the reporting party's phone number. Officer Pratt also tells dispatch he spoke to another witness who gave more details on the vehicle that left. Based on Officer Pratt's report, the witness Officer Pratt is referring to is... Okay, they're obviously blocking their names for their own protection. Traffic stop. Officer Robbins stops the vehicle on the turn-off road that goes into Arches National Park after he observed the van cross over the double yellow line and crosses back over and hits the curb on the passenger side. Officer Robbins reports to dispatch the driver may be intoxicated after observing the driving pattern. Officer Robbins stops the vehicle and has the female exit the vehicle, separating the male driver and the female passenger. From this point forward, the male and female, Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito, never speak to each other again while law enforcement is in contact. Brian Laundrie's statements to law enforcement. Whew. Here we go. Brian stated he and Gabby had not been drinking and said it had been a long day. Brian stated their little squabble started earlier this day when they were at the coffee shop. Brian stated they had been there for so long, from about 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. It's pretty long here. Brian stated the flies had been intense and that the flies have definitely been getting to her, Gabby. What an odd detail, Brian. What an odd freaking detail. Brian stated when they got back to the van, there was some little dirt at the back of the van. Brian stated he moved their food around and there was a little disagreement there. When asked about the disagreement, Brian stated it wasn't much of a disagreement, but went on to say that he had dirty feet and said they were little things, relationship things that they were arguing about. Brian stated Gabby was working on her website or blog and said he gave her time. Brian stated they had a nice morning, but Gabby got worked up as they were trying to get their day going. Brian said he tried to distance himself from Gabby by locking the van up and walking away. I don't like saying his name so many times, but anyway, I'm going to have to say it with a report, okay? Bear with me. Brian said while doing this, he suggested to Gabby they both take a breather. He said he felt that that was the only way for them to calm down, but Gabby was getting worked up. Brian said Gabby had her phone and was trying to get the keys from him, and that is when he was pushing her away. Brian said he knew he shouldn't push her, but stated he was just trying to push her away, stating they needed to take a minute, step back, and breathe. Brian said he had the keys because he didn't want Gabby to go anywhere, as he didn't have his phone, then added, he doesn't really have a phone. Thank you for putting that in writing, finally. He doesn't really have a phone, and was worried about her leaving without him and him being left alone. Later on, Brian would provide Officer Robbins his phone number. We see it right there. I don't really have a phone. Okay, here's my phone number. And confirmed the number by looking at his cell phone. This was interesting, considering he previously said that he didn't really have a phone. Yes. Brian said things weren't physical before the point Brian said, let's just take a breather, stating he was locking up the van and they should each go for a walk. Brian said it was at the time Gabby was trying to get the keys from him, where he demonstrated pushing her away and said that is when she hit me. Brian said he didn't get really physical, but stated he was trying to push Gabby away and not get hit. Brian said this was when he got really loud. And stated that was probably what drew everyone's attention. Brian said he was yelling, back up, get away. Brian said he was trying to make her calm down and pointed out to Gabby that everyone's watching. I don't think he said back up and get away. What? Back up, get away. I don't know. That doesn't sound like how he talks at all, but okay. Anyway, Brian said the injury near his eye was from Gabby's phone. Brian said Gabby had jumped on him and was swinging when he pushed her. Brian stated Gabby also wore rings, and the combination of the phone, her rings, and her nails are likely what caused his injuries. Park Ranger Ryan Kroll points out scratches on the left side of Brian's neck, left side of his nose, scratch near the center of his face, and bruise and bleeding on the right side of his head. Officer Robbins finds an additional injury on Brian's right bicep or tricep area. Brian said he was not in any pain and that he wasn't complaining. When asked about medication, Brian said he doesn't take any, but said Gabby has told him in the past to take Xanax because of his high anxiety. So this is very soothing to read, because finally those things that were like blanked out a bit, now here it is. When asked if Gabby takes medication, he replies while chuckling or smirking, she's just crazy. Okay then. Brian then immediately takes back the comment by saying he's just kidding. In regards to the driving behavior, Brian said he hit the curb because Gabby grabbed and turned the wheel. Brian said Gabby told him, I can't believe we're getting pulled over, when she grabbed the wheel. When asked about his speed, Brian stated it was probably from the adrenaline of getting pulled over and Gabby grabbing the wheel. Okay, right. So when Gabby grabs the wheel and the police are behind you, go faster. That's what his brain did. But I understand what he means with the adrenaline, yes. Further stating he was still shaken up from everything that just happened. Brian apologized multiple times for his driving, stating if he was driving too fast before getting pulled over, he was sorry. Brian said they were headed to the park to get water. Gabby Petito's statements to law enforcement. While still in the vehicle, Gabby is asked why she was crying. Gabby stated they'd been fighting this morning, stating there have been personal issues. Gabby states, I was distracting him from driving, I'm sorry. Once separated, Gabby said she has been having a very stressed morning, later confirming they have not been drinking and they do not drink. Gabby said she was trying to get work done and was apologizing to Brian after she had thrown a bunch of stuff in the back of the van. Gabby said she gets so stressed out and has OCD. Gabby further stated she has a mean attitude but was not trying to be mean about straightening things up. Gabby said she was apologizing but said it in a mean tone, and Brian got frustrated with her and locked her out of the van and told her to go take a breather. Gabby said she wanted to get going and said they were out of water and they were going to the park to refill with water. Gabby stated she's trying to start a blog and is building a website and has been stressed about it. Gabby stated she had so much work she was doing on her computer, and said Brian doesn't really believe that she can do any of it, which was upsetting to her. Gabby states they've been fighting all morning and Brian wouldn't let her in the van before. When asked why Brian wouldn't let her in the van, Gabby said Brian told her he needed to calm down. Gabby said she is perfectly calm and states Brian really stresses her out and said it has been a rough morning. Gabby said Brian walked away to take a breather, but she didn't want to. Gabby said she wanted to sit in the van because all her stuff was in there. Gabby stated she'd been working in the van and that is where she wanted to be. They were working in the coffee shop though, right? Were they though? My word. She said she'd been working in the van. So I wonder if they were actually sitting in the coffee shop. Now I'm wondering, or if they were sitting in the van using the coffee shop's Wi-Fi. That's a question I have right now. Feel free to comment your questions below as well. Okay, so Gabby said Brian told her to relax, but she didn't want to, so she got real mad. Gabby was asked about the injuries on her left cheek and arm. Gabby initially said she wasn't sure what caused it, stating the incident happened really fast. Gabby said she was trying to get back in the van and said that Brian's backpack was what got her. Gabby was told about witnesses that reported Brian had hit her. Gabby responded, to be honest, I definitely hit him first. Gabby said she had slapped Brian a couple of times and Brian kept telling her to shut up. Gabby said she hit Brian as I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. Okay, but I do just want to say I relate to her. I think a lot of us can relate to her getting angry if someone tells you to calm down when you are upset. That's like my worst. That makes me really angry. If it's like, just relax, just relax, just relax. Then I'm like, oh my word. It's just like so annoying if you're trying to tell someone, you know what, I'm really upset about this now, and this, and they say, just relax. It's like, those are the two words that just do anything but make a person relax, right? You can relate? Okay, so Gabby said Brian reacted by grabbing her arm so I wouldn't slap him. Officer Pratt asked if Brian only grabbed her, and she said, yeah. Officer Pratt then asked, did he hit you though? Gabby replied saying, I guess, but I hit him first. Gabby stated Brian grabbed my face, I guess, while also demonstrating the action. Gabby states, like he didn't punch me in the face. Gabby said Brian grabbed her face and said she could feel a cut on her left cheek. Gabby stated when she touches it, it burns. Remember that? Oh my word, it's like grabbing her face. When asked about the van hitting the curb, Gabby said, I hit him, and stated that was the reason Brian hit the curb. Gabby stated she was hitting Brian while he was driving, but not a lot, yeah. Well, not a lot, but yeah. Gabby said it didn't last long, and said she saw the police car behind them, and she demonstrated throwing a punch. Gabby said it was when she saw the police lights that she hit Brian and said, you're so stupid, or you're an idiot. Gabby said she did not touch the steering wheel, but only for like a second. I just saw the lights come on. Gabby demonstrated the punch she did to Brian while stating, you're an idiot. Gabby was asked again if she ever touched the steering wheel, and Gabby said, no, I didn't touch the steering wheel at all. Gabby was asked if she takes any medication, and she stated she didn't. Gabby said she does yoga as a coping mechanism and states she has high anxiety and OCD. When asked if Brian is patient with her, Gabby said, yeah, but I get it just makes me upset. I know he definitely gets frustrated with me a lot because I have a lot of anxiety, and he definitely has anxiety too. Oh man, if two people have very high levels of anxiety, just learning from this whole thing, I would say don't get in a tiny space, a confined space, and live together. Ooh, you could both get so riled up, you just don't know what all could happen or go wrong, because that just sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? I know a lot of people that go for the van life, go for it because it's like, oh my word, they're so stressed, so anxious, so, I don't know, yearning for adventure, for just being out in nature and just sort of being off grid, of course. But man, if you both got anxiety and if couples speculatively have any mental health problems or anything like that, whoa, it's like not recommended, huh? Wow. So, written and verbal witness statement. Officer Pratt called one of the witnesses via a cell phone, also provided a sworn written statement later on. They stated he had observed Brian and Gabby involved in a dispute. Stated from what he could tell, it appeared at one point they may have been fighting over a phone and thought it may have been Gabby's phone. Reported Brian was trying to keep Gabby from getting into the van. Said Brian was sitting in the driver's seat while Gabby was trying to get into the van through the driver's side door. Said Gabby hit Brian a few times in the arm and or face while trying to get into the vehicle. Said Gabby forced her way over Brian's lap via the driver's side door and got into the passenger seat. Then heard Gabby tell Brian, "Why do you have to be so mean?" Okay, heard Gabby tell Brian, "Why do you have to be so mean?" Stated he wasn't sure if it was play fighting, stating Gabby's punches were nothing like slugs to the face, but felt something was off and had a weird vibe. Stated he wasn't sure how serious the incident was, but to him it seemed like Brian was trying to leave Gabby and possibly take her cell phone. Officer Pratt asked if ever saw Brian strike Gabby. They hesitated in his answer and stated he maybe saw a push or a shove, but nothing like a full-on punch to the face or anything. Officer Pratt asked if they could tell if the push or shove was an aggressive action or a defensive maneuver. I wasn't sure, stating that it was a good question and wasn't entirely sure what exactly was going on. Said it appeared to him that Brian was trying to close off the passenger side of the vehicle and close things up. Said Brian put a backpack or something on the back of the vehicle. Said Brian was stepping into the vehicle and Gabby was trying to get in. Said he didn't see anything that was Brian kicking Gabby or hitting Gabby, further stating that the fighting was kind of light and they were laughing. Laughing? Whoa. That's probably when they realized everyone's watching them. It's like, okay. So they again said that Brian was in the driver's seat and had the driver door open and Gabby was hitting Brian near the arm or maybe in the face with an open hand and was telling Brian to let her in. Officer Pratt made arrangements to pick up a statement from at a later time and said he would start writing down what he remembered while it was still fresh on his memory. Said he was casually observing the incident and said again that something seemed off. The statement was attached to the report. Okay, we're on page 7. Officer Robbins is the investigating officer in this case and was assisted by Officer Pratt. It is my understanding and assumption through watching the body-worn camera videos that Officer Pratt is more experienced than Officer Robbins and was taking an action role in guiding Officer Robbins throughout this investigation. At the end of the investigation, when another call came out, Officer Pratt asked Officer Robbins if he, Officer Robbins, would feel more comfortable taking the call that just came out, leaving Officer Pratt to conclude the investigation. Ultimately, it was decided Officer Robbins would conclude this case and Officer Pratt left the scene. Officer Robbins advised Gabby that she was not going to be getting charged with anything, but stated he had to separate her and Brian for the night. Officer Robbins tells Brian the same thing, stating that since Gabby did not intend to hurt him, technically speaking, it does not fit the letter of the code, so he was not charging Gabby with DV assault. Officer Robbins advises them both to not have any contact with each other until the following day and allows Gabby to take custody of the van while Officer Robbins transports Brian to the Bowen Motel. During the investigation, Officer Pratt spoke to Brian and Gabby to gather the facts of this case. Officer Robbins spoke with Brian and Gabby and took photographs of Brian's injuries and both of their driver's licenses. Summary and evidence. This section will include the initial complaint, the applicable Utah Code sections, and the applicable Moab City Police Department policies. If there are any other policy sections outside of the DV policy, those sections will also be addressed. In total, this will highlight all sections that will attempt to investigate and, if possible, provide a conclusion on whether or not there was a violation, whether it be of law or policy. Since there was a formal complaint, those complaints will be noted first. For the findings, as it relates to various policies and or laws, I will provide the following responses. Unfounded, investigation finds there was no violation. Exonerated, investigation finds a violation did occur, but that was justified, lawful, and or proper. Not sustained, Investigation finds there is insufficient evidence to sustain or exonerate a violation of the specific code or policy, or sustained. Investigation finds sufficient evidence to establish that the code or policy was violated. Formal complaints from attorney Tanya Reeves. So there's going to be a complaint and a response. An officer discussed his wife's private medical diagnosis and prescribed medication with Brian Laundrie while transporting him to the police station, which was captured on body cam and subsequently released without redaction. So the response is, Brian was not transported to the police station. He was transported to a local motel. Moab City Police Policy, Chapter 342, Department Use of Social Media, Section 342.5, Prohibited Content, addresses the information that is prohibited for release. Line item H states personal information of an officer or the officer's immediate family member. Moab City Police Policy, Chapter 422, Portable Audio Video Recorders, Section 422.4, Member Privacy Expectations states all recording made by members on any department-issued device at any time, and any recording made while acting in an official capacity of this department, regardless of ownership of the device it was made on, shall remain the property of the department. Members shall have no expectation of privacy or ownership interest in the content of these recordings. Moab City Police Policy, Chapter 422, Portable Audio Video Recorders, Section 422.10, Review of Recorded Media Files, last paragraph states, all recordings should be reviewed by the custodian of records prior to public release. Recordings that unreasonably violate a person's privacy or sense of dignity should not be publicly released unless disclosure is required by law or order of the court. This specific complaint is regarding personal information that was discussed by Officer Robbins regarding his wife. The complaint states that Officer Robbins disclosed his wife's medical diagnosis and prescribed medication with Brian Laundrie. At no point during their discussion did Officer Robbins specifically disclose any of these things. Officer Robbins states his wife has anxiety and takes medication for it, although the line can be drawn and an assumption could be made that there is a diagnosis because of taking medication. We don't know what the actual diagnosis is or what medication she's taking or even if the medication is prescribed. I was also unable to find anywhere in Moab City Department Police where it specifies what constitutes personal information and where the line is drawn, and what can and cannot be released as it relates to that. Okay, valid points. Officer Robbins and Officer Pratt spent approximately 75 minutes with Brian and Gabby. That's a long time, right? Man, 75 minutes, okay, and demonstrated throughout their contact their ability to have an authentic and respectful conversation regarding this incident. During the interaction, Officer Robbins and Officer Pratt felt comfortable enough to share details regarding their personal lives that related to Brian and Gabby's relationship and this incident. Officer Robbins is aware of his body-worn camera that was on and recording, and also knows or should know he has no expectation of privacy as it relates to his law enforcement interactions with the public. Additionally, while knowing his body-worn camera is on, if Officer Robbins was comfortable sharing the generic details he did with Brian, it would be difficult to say that he unreasonably violated his wife's privacy or sense of dignity unless a complaint was made by Officer Robbins's wife herself, which I'm assuming it was not. Several officers discussed the legislator's intent to remove discretion from the responding officers in suspected DV calls and strategize around how they can evade the imposition of legislative intent to arrest and/or cite suspects. This concern is addressed in detail later on in the report. To provide a brief response, I would disagree that the officers strategized their way around the statute. I would say the officers made a mistake by not reading the entire assault statute, as well as misinterpreting the language in the statute. An officer appears to carefully and deliberately coach Gabby Petito to answer questions regarding intent in a manner that would allow the officer to avoid issuing her a citation or arrest. Some of the statements made by Officer Pratt to Gabby during the questioning are below. Officer Pratt tells Gabby he has a question for her, and how she answered the question determined what happened next, and further states that she was the only one that could answer the question. Think very hard before you answer the question. When you slapped him those times, were you attempting to cause him physical pain or physical impairment? Gabby answers immediately, shaking her head side to side and stating no. What were you attempting to do? What was the reason behind the slapping and stuff? What were you attempting to accomplish by slapping him? Gabby replies, I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. Officer Pratt says out loud, well, it doesn't sound like to me she attempted to injure him. We remember that. I asked Officer Pratt if he recalled the manner in which he questioned Gabby regarding her intent. Officer Pratt stated he recalled telling Gabby to not answer quickly and to think about the questions before answering them. Officer Pratt said, I do recall telling her to think about it because it's important and I think it's a fair thing to tell somebody. I mean, I must agree, it's just like, whoa, don't just answer this just quickly. Here we go with a very important question. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Officer Pratt said, you would have to assume that Gabby knew what answer Officer Pratt wanted to give him, which he never provided her. Officer Pratt said, what I didn't want to see that day was her take all of the criminal responsibility for this incident upon herself at 22 years old. I asked Officer Pratt if he deliberately coached Gabby in her responses to his questions regarding her intent. Officer Pratt said he had no idea what she was going to say. Officer Pratt acknowledged that he could see why some people might think he coached her. Officer Pratt said, I truly did not know what she was going to say next. I was afraid that she was going to say something that was going to make her go to jail. I didn't want her to go to jail, but I would have taken her to jail if she had said the other thing, and I don't consider giving someone fair warning to think about the answer because it's an important question to be coaching. Officer Pratt stated multiple times that he wanted an honest answer out of Gabby. Officer Pratt said the way he asked the questions was to stress the importance to Gabby to think about the question and provide an honest answer. Officer Pratt said, maybe I coached her into giving me an honest answer because that's what I was wanting. That's what I wanted, and honestly, that's haunted me. Her saying, I just wanted him to stop telling me to calm down. She's little. I have daughters. I can imagine them in these situations. I can totally see one of my daughters just wanting someone to stop telling them to calm down. I believe what she said. I believed it then. I still do. Officer Pratt said he was not deliberately coaching Gabby and just wanted an honest answer. Officer Robbins was present during the above questioning. I asked Officer Robbins if he recalled this conversation and he said, vaguely. I asked if Officer Robbins recalled the manner in which the questions were asked. Officer Robbins said he didn't and only remembered Gabby being asked about the intent and her denying the intent to hurt Brian. Okay, number 4. An officer refers to Gabby Petito as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl who is 110 pounds dripping wet and refers to Brian Laundrie as a big, tough, strong guy who can defend himself, which is not relevant. Oh, that was hard to read. Which is not relevant evidence when evaluating the protocol for legislator-mandated action in DV calls. Further, it is unclear why the eye and hair color of one of the subjects would be material to any analysis, and may suggest the officers were operating under a confirmation bias or that they were unconsciously influenced by stereotypes about who is involved in DV. The complainant, Tanya Reeves, sent a follow-up email apologizing and stated she misattributed the blonde-haired, blue-eyed remark, which is correct as she states in her follow-up email. That information was said by Brian, not the officers. The first part of this complaint is addressed in further detail in this report. I do remember that, Brian saying that. Like he was saying, like, oh, she's a little blonde girl, blonde, blue eyes, 110 pounds, dripping wet. I don't remember if that was him saying that. Do you? I'll have to go look at it again. Oh my word. I have to look at it again. But yeah, stereotypes and just, I think Brian was just trying to be like, oh, you're right. Like she would, like I would be the victim of DV. I think he started getting embarrassed that he was going to be filed as a victim of DV. Number 5, an officer makes disparaging references to the legislation relevant to this call in the presence of the subjects, claiming that he cannot treat the subjects differently because of the gender of the primary aggressor, and then proceeds to do precisely that. While reviewing the body-worn camera footage, this topic is discussed on multiple occasions. Officer Pratt discusses with Brian, Gabby, and other officers the lack of discretion in these cases. When describing this to Brian and Gabby, he explains that it doesn't matter the gender and or size of whoever the primary aggressor is, or if the injuries are minimal. Officer Pratt states that they have to treat all DV assault cases the same. Officer Pratt tells Gabby that the law doesn't allow them to treat people different, stating, even if it makes no sense that you probably could not physically destroy this man, that he could if he attacked you. What? Destroy this man the way that he could if he attacked you. We can't treat you different. He further tells Gabby that the law was made in Utah because they don't trust the police to make good decisions because too many cops have made bad decisions. He goes on to say that is why they took discretion away on DV cases, stating that whoever the primary aggressor is has to be charged. We don't have any choice in this. He further states that if he had discretion, he would separate them for the night and tell them to stop hitting each other, but I lawfully don't have discretion here. While an argument could be made that his statements were disparaging, it was done in the context of trying to explain what law enforcement could and could not do. As far as the officers doing precisely what they said they couldn't do, that is explained in further detail in this report. Number 6. The officer references a 911 call that identified Brian Laundrie pushing Gabby Petito away from him, and then says there's a second witness who they haven't spoken with yet, but may corroborate this claim. The 911 call of the second witness in fact claims Brian Laundrie slapped Gabby Petito. Should the officer have obtained this statement from the second witness, or listened to the 911 call before determining who was the primary aggressor? There was only one 911 call in reference to this incident. That caller reported Brian slapping Gabby. The other witness was found on scene at the Moonflower and provided a verbal and written statement later on. This issue is addressed in more detail later on in the report, but in short, the answer would be yes. The officers should have obtained a statement from the 911 caller before making a final determination, if it was possible for them to do so. Number 7, the officers twisted themselves into knots trying to find a way to avoid effecting an arrest or citation because of their sympathy for this couple and their assessment that no one was actually in danger, which is precisely what the legislator attempted to curtail, substituting the judgment of the officers for the mandates of legislation. I believe it is clear from the body-worn camera footage that stating the officers twisted themselves into knots trying to find ways to avoid effecting an arrest is a gross mischaracterization of what actually happened. Law enforcement is being second-guessed now more than ever, which has led to officers taking more caution and time as allowed before making a decision to try and avoid the inevitable second-guessing. These officers were authentic in their interactions and treated Brian and Gabby with kindness and respect. I would say the officers displayed sympathy and empathy for this couple, which undoubtedly led to Officer Pratt second-guessing himself, despite the fact that he said multiple times what needed to happen. Officer Pratt resorted to calling a supervisor and then rereading the assault statute. From there, the statute is not fully read, and what was read was misinterpreted, which led to not arresting anyone in this incident. So they do admit it was misinterpreted and led to not arresting anyone, which means if they interpreted correctly, they would have arrested probably both, Gabby and Brian, or at least one of them. The officer concluded, this is now number 8, the officer concluded in his report that he did not believe the incident rose to the level of DV so much as a mental health crisis. Have officers received sufficient training in mental illness and DV to accurately make the determination? I was unable to answer this question in full, but asked both officers for an explanation into why they categorized this incident in such a way. Their responses are documented later on in this report. Number 9. One additional concern I wish to add to my complaint is the officer's lack of investigatory follow-up. Yes, that was my complaint. After Gabby Petito told him that Brian had grabbed her face with his fingers, digging into the point of causing a cut on the inside of her cheek. It was hard to discern her exact words, although I did hear the word cut, but she seemed to indicate that her cheek was swelling up or tender, and she cupped it with her hand as she described the injury. The very first question the officer asked in response to this was if Brian had been drinking. His very next question returns to the swerve and curb strike incident. In the footage available to me, he never returns to Gabby's allegation of a crime to ask more questions, investigate, or follow up in any manner. Man, that would have been so great, and of course to follow up the next day. That's what I was going for. Oh, if they followed up with him the next day just to make sure that Brian and Gabby knew, especially Brian, of course, we're watching you. Like, what are you doing? Did you spend the night apart? Oh, that would have been so great. The officers seemed distracted by the centerline swerve and curb strike and the admission that Gabby had punched Brian in the shoulder when the lights were activated. They spent the majority of the investigation pursuing this allegation, while the reason for the initial detention, the 2 911 calls reporting a man shoving or slapping a woman, fell by the wayside. Even when Gabby reports a battery that caused injury, her statement is entirely ignored because the officers seem to be operating under a confirmation bias that influenced how they interpret the evidence and their theory of the case. Brian was thoroughly examined for evidence, including an examination underneath his clothing for injuries of which he may not be aware. Right? Photographic evidence was obtained, and he was offered EMS services for his injuries. None of this appears to have been provided to Gabby Petito, even after she reported a battery resulting in injury. Yes, why did they not take pictures of her hands, of her body, to just document it equally? These concerns are addressed in multiple sections throughout this report. Okay, so on the next page, we've got the Utah State Code, page 13 of 102. So now you can see why I'm doing multiple parts of breaking down this document. So in the next ones, we will continue here on the Utah State Code. I want to chunk it for you so that it's easily digestible. So part 1 is now done. Make sure that you check out the playlist and that you follow the parts chronologically so that we can go through part 1, 2, 3, 4, and so we go on. At this rate, there'll be quite a few parts, isn't it? Thank you so much for watching the introduction as I go through this document. I know that there's people, of course, on Twitter just breaking down little bits by little bits and doing millions of interviews and things. What I'm going to do here for you, for the Grizzlies, is go page by page. 102 pages. We'll go through it together, line by line, because it's too difficult to try to just pick out what's important and what's not, because everything's important in this document. To me, every single line matters, every single word matters, so we're going to go through all of it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.